$1. 48 hours. 2 hectares of farmland in southern Korea. Soil so chemically exhausted that nothing would grow on it for 3 full seasons, quietly returning to life. The year was 1975. The ingredient came from an ordinary kitchen rice pot, and the global fertilizer industry has spent the last 50 years pretending this discovery never happened. Across America right now, more than half of all topsoil has lost the living organisms that once made it fertile. Pale, dusty, blowing away with the first dry wind. And the strange, almost unbelievable truth is this: the cure is not sold in any garden center. It is sitting in a kitchen pantry, in a bag of plain white rice that costs less than a postcard. What follows is the story of how that secret was discovered, why it was buried, what modern science has finally proven about it, and exactly how to make it at home this week. Keep watching. The most surprising part comes near the end, and most lifelong gardeners have never heard a single word of it. Part 1. The silent crisis beneath our feet and a 9,000-year-old secret. Have you ever knelt down in a garden bed, pressed a finger into the dirt, and felt nothing but dust? No softness, no moisture, no smell of life. Just powder that runs through the fingers like flour. That feeling has a name. Soil scientists call it biological collapse, and it is happening in backyards across America at a pace nobody talks about. For most of the last century, soil was treated like a parking lot for plants. Something to anchor the roots, a sponge to hold whatever liquid fertilizer was poured on top. But healthy soil is nothing like a parking lot. A single teaspoon of living soil holds more individual organisms than there are human beings on the entire planet. Bacteria, fungi, microscopic worms, single-celled hunters and gatherers, billions of them in 1 teaspoon. Take that same teaspoon from a chemically farmed field, and most of those organisms are gone, killed off by repeated doses of synthetic fertilizer, fungicide, and herbicide. What remains is mineral powder. It cannot hold water. It cannot release nutrients on its own. It cannot defend a tomato seedling against the first soil-borne fungus that drifts in on the breeze. So the gardener buys another bottle, and another, and the cycle tightens. Here is the part that gets buried in glossy garden center brochures. The cure for that collapse is not a new product. It is roughly 9,000 years old. In the Yangtze River Valley of ancient China, the very first rice farmers noticed something quiet but powerful. The cloudy water left over from rinsing their daily rice, milky, faintly sweet, full of starch, was not waste. When poured on the ground, the plants nearby grew taller, greener, stronger through dry weeks. They did not know the word bacteria. They did not need to. They saw the result. That observation traveled east. Roughly 3,000 years ago, it reached the Korean peninsula, and there it met a tradition that changed everything: fermentation. Korean households were already living laboratories, turning cabbage into kimchi, soybeans into deep, savory pastes, fish into sauce. They began letting the rice rinse water sit in clay jars called ongi, breathable vessels that allowed the wild airborne microbes of the local farmstead to drift in and settle. After a few warm days, the liquid turned slightly tart and faintly fragrant. Spread on a vegetable patch, it produced visible results within a single growing cycle. Generation after generation passed this practice down. Grandmothers showed it to granddaughters. It was not science, it was simply what worked. Until one day, a chemical empire arrived from across the sea and quietly began telling Korean farmers it was all superstition. Part 2. The visionary who refused to let it die. What does it take for one farmer to stand against an entire global industry? Not a degree, not a fortune, just the stubborn refusal to watch grandmother's wisdom be erased. By the middle of the 20th century, the so-called Green Revolution was sweeping through Asia. Multinational chemical companies pushed synthetic nitrogen, patented hybrid seeds, and a promise of bigger harvests forever. The first few seasons looked miraculous. The yields shot up. Then the soil began to fail. Within a decade, paddies that had fed families for centuries needed more chemical input every year just to produce the same modest crop. In Japan, a quiet philosopher named Masanobu Fukuoka watched this unfold and walked away from chemistry entirely. He published a small book called The One Straw Revolution, arguing that nature, left alone, outproduces nature managed by chemists. The book made its way across the sea. In South Korea, a young farmer named Cho Han-kyu read it and felt something snap into place. Born in 1935 into a traditional farming family, Cho had grown up watching his country's soils thin and pale beneath the new chemical regime. He had even attended formal agricultural college, where he was taught the modern chemical doctrine. And yet every instinct he had about the land kept whispering that something was deeply wrong. So he went home, to the same family fields, to the same clay jars his grandmother had used, and he began running careful, patient experiments, not in a laboratory, but in the soil itself. He fermented rice rinse water. He cultured native microbes from the leaf litter of the nearby mountain forest. He fed them to depleted rice paddies and recorded what happened, week by week, season by season. His critics laughed. Other farmers told him he had lost his mind. University colleagues dismissed him in print. And then, slowly, they stopped laughing. By 1975, Cho was running larger trials on land that had been declared agriculturally finished, over-farmed, over-treated, essentially sterile. Within 48 hours of the first application of his fermented rice serum, visible microbial activity returned to the surface of the soil. Within a month, the texture and crumb structure of that ground had measurably changed under his hands. By harvest, the yields on his recovering paddies were competitive with the chemically managed neighboring plots. He had spent almost nothing. His chemical neighbors had spent a small fortune. Cho went on to found the Janong Natural Farming Institute, codifying a complete system the world now calls Korean natural farming. He was not imprisoned, despite some dramatic stories online, but he was professionally ostracized, ridiculed in the agricultural press, and for years denied any official recognition by the Korean government's extension service. The institutions had too much invested in the chemical model to admit that a farmer with a rice pot had outperformed them. Why does that matter? Because it shows exactly how powerful the discovery was, and exactly why it had to be hidden. Part 3. Why the garden center will never tell you about this. Here is a question worth sitting with. If something works, costs almost nothing, can be made at home, and cannot be patented, what happens to it inside a market economy? The honest answer is uncomfortable. It gets quietly forgotten. The global synthetic fertilizer business is worth more than $200 billion a year. The market for commercial soil amendments adds tens of billions more. None of that revenue depends on plants growing well in the long run. It depends on customers coming back to buy another bag in the spring. A method that genuinely heals soil, that makes the gardener less dependent on bottled inputs every year, not more, is a threat to that revenue model. This is not a conspiracy. It is simpler and more honest than that. It is just market logic. A product that cannot be patented cannot be marketed at scale. A product that cannot be marketed at scale will not get research funding. A product without research funding will not be recommended by university extension programs because those programs are partly underwritten by industry grants. And a product that is not recommended by extension programs will never reach the local garden center shelves. The chain is automatic. Nobody has to plot anything. The system simply forgets. Korean natural farming was forgotten in exactly this way for decades. Outside of small farming circles in Asia and Hawaii, almost nobody in the West had heard of it. Books on it were not translated. The seminars Cho ran in Korea were attended mostly by farmers who had already given up on the chemical promise. Mainstream agriculture moved on, certain that progress meant another bottle, another spray, another invoice. And yet truth has a strange habit. It waits. And eventually, when the science catches up, the truth comes back to the surface, whether the marketing department wants it there or not. Part 4. When the microscope finally caught up. What happens when a real laboratory, with real instruments, finally puts grandmother's rice water under a microscope? The answer, beginning in the early 2000s, was this. She had been right all along. Researchers at the University of Hawaii's College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources, working alongside Korean natural farming practitioners, ran controlled trials on the fermented rice serum and the broader system Cho had built. Their findings, published in journals including Applied Soil Ecology, confirmed something the chemical industry had spent 50 years dismissing. The lactic acid bacteria captured by the rice water method genuinely accelerated the breakdown of organic matter in the soil. They genuinely suppressed common soil-borne pathogens. They genuinely improved soil structure in measurable ways. Field trials in tropical and temperate climates alike produced yields competitive with conventional chemical treatment, at a tiny fraction of the cost. Here is the moment that stops most gardeners in their tracks. Lactic acid bacteria are not exotic. They are not rare. They are the same family of microbes that turn milk into yogurt. The same microbes that turn cabbage into sauerkraut. The same microbes that live right now inside the human gut, keeping a person's digestion working. The cure for dying soil is the same family of organisms keeping every viewer of this video alive. How does it actually work in the ground? On a microscopic level, lactic acid bacteria do three things at once. First, they consume sugars and release lactic acid, which gently lowers the local pH around plant roots. That mild acidity is hostile to many of the harmful fungi and bacteria, the kinds that cause damping off in seedlings, root rot in tomatoes, fusarium wilt in beans. Second, they secrete sticky compounds called exopolysaccharides, biological glues, that bind tiny soil particles into crumb-like aggregates. Soil with good crumb structure breathes better, drains better, holds water longer, and releases nutrients more steadily. Third, they unlock complex organic matter that has been sitting in the soil for years, freeing the locked-up nitrogen, phosphorus, and trace minerals so plant roots can finally reach them. And here is something almost nobody mentions, even in the gardening books that do cover this method. The lactic acid bacteria are only part of the story. Once they have softened the soil environment and quieted the harmful microbes, the truly heavy lifting is taken over by mycorrhizal fungi, the long, thread-like fungal partners that wrap around plant roots and extend their reach by 10, 20, sometimes 100 times. Those fungi cannot survive in chemically sterilized ground, but they thrive in soil that has been quietly prepared by lactic acid bacteria. The bacteria are the welcoming committee. The fungi are the long-term residents who do the deep work, which means a single gallon of fermented rice serum, used correctly, is not just feeding the soil. It is rebuilding the entire underground community that the chemical years drove out. Part 5. The $1 recipe, step by step. Now to the part most viewers came for. How does an ordinary gardener actually make this serum at home, in a kitchen, without any laboratory equipment? The answer is almost embarrassingly simple. But there are three small mistakes that beginners almost always make, and any one of them will ruin a whole batch. Watch closely. Step 1. Catching the microbes. Begin with a half cup of plain, uncooked white rice. Put it in a clean glass bowl and add about 2 cups of water. Here is the first common mistake. The water cannot be straight from the tap in most American homes. Municipal tap water contains chlorine, and chlorine kills the very microbes the recipe is trying to capture. The fix is easy. Fill a pitcher of tap water and let it sit uncovered on the counter overnight. The chlorine evaporates on its own. Or use rainwater, well water, or filtered water. Swirl the rice vigorously with the dechlorinated water until the water turns cloudy and milky white. That cloudiness is starch lifting off the grains, and that starch is exactly what the wild microbes will feed on. Pour the cloudy liquid into a clean glass jar, filling it only about 2/3 of the way. The empty space at the top matters. Step 2. Letting the wild air do its work. Cover the mouth of the jar with a paper towel or a square of cheesecloth, secured with a rubber band. Do not use a tight lid. The microbes need to breathe. Set the jar in a quiet, dark, warm spot. A kitchen cabinet, a pantry shelf, anywhere out of direct sunlight, ideally between 65 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Then wait 3 to 5 days. By the end of that window, the rice water will smell faintly sour and slightly sweet, something close to plain yogurt. That smell is the sign of success. Wild lactic acid bacteria have drifted in from the local air and colonized the jar. If the liquid smells rotten, ammonia-like, or aggressively unpleasant, something else moved in first, and the batch should be discarded. Start over with cleaner equipment. Step 3. Multiplying the good microbes. Now comes the second common mistake. Many beginners assume any milk will work for the next stage. It will not. Strain the fermented rice water through a fine cloth into a larger clean jar, leaving any film or sediment behind. Then add fresh milk in a ratio of 1 part rice water to 10 parts milk. Use ordinary pasteurized whole milk. Avoid ultra-pasteurized or shelf-stable milk. The extreme heat treatment damages the milk proteins and slows the next fermentation badly. Plain whole milk from a refrigerator case works beautifully. The lactose in milk is the perfect food for the lactic acid bacteria, and their population now explodes. Cover the jar again with breathable cloth. Return it to the dark cabinet. Wait another 3 to 7 days. Step 4. Harvesting the gold. Open the jar at the end of that second wait, and a quiet miracle has taken place. The mixture has separated into 3 layers. On top, a thick, pale, cheese-like curd of milk solids. On the bottom, a thin layer of starchy sediment. And in the middle, a clear golden yellow liquid, sometimes the color of weak tea, sometimes closer to sunshine. That golden middle layer is the lactic acid bacteria serum. It is the entire point of the recipe. Carefully draw off the golden liquid using a turkey baster, a small siphon, or a slow, steady pour through a strainer. The curd on top is not waste. It can be fed to chickens, mixed into the compost pile, or even spread thin on heavy clay garden beds, where it will continue to feed soil life. Nothing is thrown away. Step 5. Storing and using it. Mix the golden serum with an equal weight of dark brown sugar or unsulfured molasses. The sugar acts as a natural preservative. It puts the bacteria into a kind of dormant sleep, and the finished serum will keep on a cool pantry shelf for up to a year, sometimes longer. Label the jar with the date. Store away from direct heat. Now the third common mistake, and the one that ruins more gardens than the first 2 combined. Beginners assume that if a little is good, more must be better. They are wrong. The dilution rate is 1 tablespoon of serum per gallon of dechlorinated water. That is the correct dose. Anything stronger temporarily acidifies the soil too sharply and can stress young plants. Stick to 1 tablespoon per gallon. Use the diluted mixture to drench garden beds at the root zone, to spray lightly on the foliage of struggling plants, or to pour over a tired compost pile to wake it up. A single home-brewed batch from less than $1 of rice and milk will treat a sizable backyard garden for an entire season. Apply once every 2 to 4 weeks during the growing year. That is the entire program. Part 6. The forgotten idea that plants have life stages, just like people. Here is the part of Korean natural farming that almost no Western gardening book talks about. And it may be the most quietly revolutionary idea in the entire system. Conventional gardening treats a plant like a machine. The same fertilizer formula goes on the seedling as goes on the flowering adult. The same dose, the same blend, from sprout to harvest. Cho Han-kyu watched his country's farmers do this for years, and he asked a simple, almost childlike question. Why? Nobody feeds an infant the same diet as a teenager. Nobody feeds a teenager the same diet as an expectant mother. So why does anyone feed a tomato plant the same thing on day 20 as on day 80? Plants have life stages. They have shifting needs. And once a gardener begins to see that, the entire experience of growing food changes. In the early vegetative stage, a plant is in childhood. It is building leaves, stems, the basic frame of its body. It needs nitrogen above all. In Korean natural farming, this stage is fed with fish amino acids, a homemade liquid made by fermenting fish scraps with brown sugar. Cheap, effective, smells unforgettable, but the plants love it. Then the plant reaches its turning point. It begins shifting from making leaves to making flowers. This is where the system uses one of the warmest, most human metaphors in all of gardening. Cho called it the plant's morning sickness. Just as a pregnant woman's body craves sour, sharp foods during the early months, a plant about to flower craves slightly sour, phosphorus-rich nutrition. Korean natural farming feeds this stage with fermented plant juices, drawn from fast-growing weeds, and fermented fruit juices, drawn from ripe local fruit. And finally, when the plant is loaded with developing fruit, it needs one thing more than any other: calcium, strong cell walls, sweet, firm tomatoes, crisp peppers, apples that store through winter without going soft. Most American gardeners reach for a bottle of calcium supplement at this point. Korean natural farmers reach for the eggshells in the kitchen compost bowl. They roast the shells until brittle, crush them, and dissolve them in plain brown rice vinegar. The vinegar releases the calcium into a form the plant can drink up through its roots within hours. Nothing is bought, nothing is wasted. Now here is the controversial part. Plenty of master gardeners will say this is too complicated, too fussy, too far outside the simple bag of fertilizer routine they have used for decades. And yet the gardeners who do learn the rhythm of these life stages almost never go back. Their tomatoes taste different, their peppers store longer, their soil, year after year, gets visibly darker, looser, sweeter smelling. The bag of fertilizer routine never produces those results, no matter how expensive the bag. Which raises a quiet, slightly uncomfortable question. After 50 years of being told that gardening means buying products, what would happen if the most important thing a gardener ever learned came not from a store, but from a kitchen? Conclusion: the quiet revolution on the kitchen counter. The road back to living soil does not require permission from any corporation. It does not require a budget. It does not require a degree, a certification, or a single trip to the garden center. The knowledge needed to heal a backyard, to grow real food for grandchildren, to leave a piece of ground better than it was found, that knowledge has been here all along. It was simply outshouted by louder voices selling something else. Every quiet jar of rice water bubbling on a kitchen counter is a small, gentle act of independence, a reminder that life makes more life, that the soil remembers what people were taught to forget, that the most powerful tool in any garden may already be sitting in the pantry, waiting to be noticed. So the next time a pot of rice gets rinsed under the tap, do not let that cloudy water disappear down the drain. Save it. Let it ferment. Pour it onto the patch of ground that everyone else has given up on. And then watch what 9,000 years of buried wisdom can do in 48 hours. If this discovery surprised you, share it with the gardener in your life who has been fighting tired soil for years. Leave a comment about the toughest patch of ground in your own yard and which season you plan to try this. And subscribe to Rooted Grace, where every week the old, real, almost forgotten ways of growing food are pulled back into the sunlight, one quiet story at a time. Keep your hands in the earth, keep your soil alive, and keep your kitchen close, because the future of your garden may already be sitting on the counter.